I can show you lots of these, but I had a post on Instagram that came through, and I screenshotted it because it was a woman who was very proud of herself transitioning to be a man. And it showed her before and it showed her after. You would not know that that was a woman. She'd done all the surgeries. She had all the male body parts. She was a man. And I thought to myself, one of the many reasons I voted against it is when I go to Lava Hot Springs, do I want that man changing with my 17-year-old daughter? We are often more concerned about, when we had younger kids, more concerned about our boys going into a men's bathroom without my wife when I wasn't around. Because men are just as dirty to little boys as they are to girls and women. This bill didn't protect them. When you also look at the exceptions, one of the exceptions was dire need. So if you are in dire need, you can use whatever bathroom is available to you. Who decides whether or not you're in dire need? Is a police officer supposed to go check the toilet? Oh wait, you flushed it. How are you supposed to do that? And so again, talking to the sheriff, they said, look, if somebody calls and says that there's a man in the woman's bathroom and I show up, I'm going to say, why are you in the bathroom? And they're going to say, I was in dire need. Well, okay. So all we did is took a police officer off the street. So now he didn't pull over the car that's transporting fentanyl across the state lines. He didn't answer a domestic violence call to protect a woman who's being beaten by her husband or boyfriend because he was busy at the Texas Roadhouse asking a man who had diarrhea whether or not why he was in the women's bathroom. And I will tell you from personal experience, I have gone to a bathroom with a stall and a urinal. So this would qualify because it's a multi-use bathroom, and both were occupied, and I had to go. So if I went into the women's bathroom because it wasn't occupied and came out, and some Karen says, hey, police, I just saw a man come out of the women's bathroom, and now I'm sitting with my family having dinner, and guess who shows up? The police. And she points me out. And now I've got to answer in the Texas Roadhouse in front of everybody that I was in dire need. It was the biggest loophole in the world. You want to be a perp and you want to go into a women's bathroom and you want to record things and you want to do bad stuff, you just have dire need. No problem. It was a bad bill.
Wow. That logic is all over the map. So let's start right at the beginning. First of all, a woman cannot become a man. You can have all the hormone treatments you want, you can have all the surgeries that you want, but a woman can never have male body parts. You can only create the appearance of the opposite sex. You can never make a woman a man or vice versa. So let's just start right there. We can tell what a woman is. Now, let's take another little baby step. Since we know that there are women and that there are men and that they're not interchangeable, do we think that we should have sex-specific spaces? Is that a good idea? I think that's a good idea. So let's go from there to the next logical fallacy, which is this idea that if the bill doesn't stop every kind of perpetration, the bill's no good. So because some men might perpetrate against a little boy and this particular bill won't stop every kind of harm, the bill's worthless. Well, that's not logical at all. The question still is there a benefit to having sex-separated spaces? And the easy answer is yes, there is. So then we go from that logical fallacy to the idea that the exceptions in the bill made it useless. All right. So first of all, if a police officer comes and they're called to come, they don't just hang out at the bathroom all the time waiting for someone to walk into the wrong bathroom. But if a police officer is called because someone is in the wrong bathroom, that police officer is not the one that has to decide whether the exception exempts them from being responsible for that behavior. They issue a citation. And we have a judicial system so that a judge can make that decision if there's a question. It's not up to the police officer. The reasonable exceptions are there so that a judge could say, I understand that you were in the wrong bathroom, but I'm not going to charge you for that. I'm not going to cite you for that, I'm not going to convict you of that misdemeanor crime because you met one of these exceptions. And they'll ask questions like, were you really in dire need? How do we know? Was there another bathroom available or was there not? And they'll ask those questions, and a judge would make that decision. A police officer doesn't make that decision. But then we go completely to the opposite extreme from saying that these exceptions make the bill worthless to saying that the exceptions are the problem. And so now, all of a sudden, because there's an exception here and he uses the exception, now if he's sitting at Texas Roadhouse and the police come in, now it's a problem that he has to be asked about the exception publicly, which I don't believe would happen either. Beyond that, now we take another leap, and I'm trying to think of the last one. We've been through so many variations on this. There was one more. Yeah, so I remember what the last one was, and that is this idea that if we add one more thing that we are going to expect our police officers to protect, that nothing else is going to get done. The reality is that if we pass this law, it will probably get used rarely. But when it does get used, it's going to be very important. And so we don't have this all or nothing kind of reasoning in real life situations. We recognize that there's give and take, but we protect the important things. And this one should make the list. So one thing that's interesting, I guess, is that if any excuse will do, there are a lot of them. But we've kind of looked at this from all different angles, and the bottom line is whether you think that it was perfect or not, it was the right thing to do. And we need to protect girls and women in private spaces.
Teton County Hospital has closed their doors this year. Part of the problem is that insurance companies aren't paying the bills. We have insurance companies here for Bingham Memorial that have taken up to 18 months to pay a major claim, and they're allowed to do it under our law. So together with Bingham Memorial, I drafted legislation to fix that. And here's one of the biggest problems with Medicaid reimbursements, with our rural hospitals, with regulations, all those types of things, is that this bill is good legislation. It would have solved a real problem. The insurance companies were on board with it, the hospitals were excited about it, and the Idaho Freedom Foundation blocked it. It was a negative score because it was going to create new government regulations, and I couldn't get a hearing in the business committee because of that. That's the reality of the Idaho political world that we have right now. When you adhere to an ideology that is driven more by getting money from out-of-state donors so that you can help get people elected, and less from solving real problems, you don't get to solve real problems. That's a real problem. So I want Idaho problems being solved by people who are from Idaho and in Idaho and care about Idaho. We need to increase the Medicaid reimbursement rates. We need to fix our budget so that we can find this money and find the value there. We need to keep Medicaid expansion going. We can't just send people to the exchange. It's not legal. Medicaid expansion is there for a reason, and it helps. We no longer have the backstops we had before. These are some of the things that we can do.
All right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start first with the assumption that this is a good bill. I think that probably every legislator thinks the bills they draft are good bills, or they wouldn't put the time into it. So that's a pretty normal assumption to make. The problem in the legislature is that you don't have to just fix the bill to satisfy yourself. You have to convince a majority of 105 other legislators that your bill is a good bill. And I texted the chairman of the business committee where this bill was submitted and where it did not get a hearing. And I said, Ben is claiming this as proof that IFF rules Boise and is the reason we can't get good things done and problems solved in Boise. The chairman's response was this: no IFF score impact on receiving a hearing. I don't look at IFF scores. 829 would have caused much more fraud, waste, and abuse in our medical system. Happy to jump on a call and discuss further, but it was a very poorly crafted bill. I'm pretty sure the hospitals gave those to the idea. And then he gave his permission for me to share his comment. So it probably was a bill that would be helpful to the hospital. It doesn't mean that the bill is completely without merit, but the idea that the bill didn't get a hearing because of the Idaho Freedom Foundation is completely without merit. And as someone who has passed a lot of legislation through the legislature, I can tell you that if I have a bill in a committee and it's not getting a hearing, it's my responsibility to sit down with the chairman and find out what their concerns are. If that had happened, it sounds like the message that would have been communicated is that there was a concern about fraud, waste, and abuse that needed to be addressed. And instead of addressing that concern, we've just chalked it up to IFF and then attacked people's motives, assuming that they have some ulterior motives, and also assuming that out-of-state people somehow control the chairman and that out-of-state people automatically have ulterior motives as well. There's just all of these leaps of logic that don't really make any sense. So we really need to get back to just talking instead of making broad accusations about groups and motives. We just need to be talking about what worked in the bill, what didn't work in the bill, and then fix that. I did speak with the chairman on the phone, and he assured me that the Idaho Freedom Foundation score is just absolutely something he doesn't even ever look at. But he also clarified that about 20% of the payments that we make through Medicaid are flagged with some kind of a problem. It doesn't mean that they all are fraud, waste, or abuse, but it does mean that about 20% of them require some extra verification in order to feel comfortable paying them, and that takes time. And so speeding up those payments was a concern. Hopefully that helps.
So this last session, I was one of those that fought pretty hard against JPAC for what I consider to be prioritizations that didn't line up with what I agree with. As a financial planner, I sit with clients. We talk about budgets. We always discuss that the state should budget like we budget in our homes. So how do we do that? We look at the revenue coming in. We look at the expenses we have. We allocate the money we have, and at the end of the month, we hope we have something left over. And usually, part of that budgeting process is setting some money aside for emergencies. We've been doing that in the state of Idaho for years, to the tune of $1.3 billion. That's how much we have in our reserve and stabilization funds. Then we left $230 million in what we call the bottom line. So imagine again, you're budgeting in your home. You go through and you say, we're going to leave a little bit left over at the end of the month, and we have thousands of dollars in savings. While at the same time you have a cluster of emergencies. The water heater breaks, the roof needs fixed, the transmission just blew. All these one-time issues that you couldn't control that need money now. That's what we were faced with. And instead of dipping into those funds to be able to cover those expenses, we cut very valuable programs. And I did not agree with it. And it's not how I would have done things. So I think we should have used our stabilizer funds, our budget stabilization funds, because that's what they're for, is to stabilize our budget. And we didn't do that. And instead, a lot of people are getting hurt. A lot.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about finances. One of the things that I've been really excited to see is the way that the state has adjusted our budget process to actually mirror what most people do with their household budget more closely. One of the things that they have done is that they begin by setting aside the mandatory expenses. We identify those, we fund them, we put them off to the side, and then the committee now has more bandwidth to focus on what are called discretionary expenses. Discretionary expenses are things that you plan to pay for. They're important, like groceries and gas, but we've called them discretionary because we get to decide how much we want to spend on them. And maybe we have steak every night, and maybe we have hot dogs, and maybe we ride our bike or hitch a ride with a neighbor, or maybe we go on a long road trip, but we get to choose. So those discretionary expenses get considered next. One of the fundamental principles that the state of Idaho has been true to in our budgeting process is that our ongoing expenses have to match our revenue. And so the example that was given here talked about a family that maybe has a bunch of one-time emergencies. But the programs that were getting cut are not one-time programs. These are ongoing expenses. And so if you are a legislator that's responsible to manage these taxpayer funds, and you can see that revenues may not cover these ongoing expenses, and you dip into those emergency funds in order to cover ongoing expenses, you may find yourself a couple of years down the road still dipping into the emergency fund unless you have some reason to believe that the economy is going to recover, and your emergency fund just gets lower and lower over time. So the key here is that these were not one-time expenditures. These were ongoing, and the legislature made the decision, I believe correctly, to ensure that our ongoing expenses match our revenue. The other thing that I think is important to say here is that we have significantly increased our spending per capita over time. I know the Democrats in Boise were passing out a chart that just showed the general fund increase in spending over time. General fund monies are only 1 out of 4 pots of monies that the state's responsible to manage. And so while it may be true that general fund spending has not increased significantly if you adjust it for population growth and inflation, if you look at the big picture, you actually find that per capita spending, when it's adjusted, went up 14% over the last 15 years. So it's easy to cherry pick one category of spending and make a case that really isn't accurate when you look at the big picture. The unfortunate thing is that the chart the Democrats cherry picked came out of an LSO report that actually had charts for all 4 categories. So all of the information was there and readily available, but only part of it got shared. Yeah, one other thing that I think is important to consider when we talk about these programs that got cut in 2026 is that Medicaid expansion accounts for a huge portion of Idaho's budget. And we had the opportunity to put sideboards on Medicaid expansion. When I say a huge part of our budget, I'm talking about 92,000 able-bodied adults with no dependents that are costing the state $1,200 per month each. Now, it's true, we do get federal funds to cover part of that, but that's an enormous sum of money, and it adds up over time, even the state's portion. So we had the opportunity to add some work requirements and put some other sideboards on Medicaid expansion in 2025. My opponent voted no on that. His vote wasn't the deciding vote in terms of the bill's ultimate fate. The bill did not get a hearing in Senate Health and Welfare, and so it didn't make it through the legislature in 2025. Then in 2026, it did finally make it through the legislature when everything was so tight. But when I think about the programs that were cut, a great example that I think was a sad loss would be managed care for children on Medicaid. That was a program that served a huge pool of children. About a third of Idaho children are actually on Medicaid. But it costs only about $18 per kid per year to have managed care where a primary care doctor is overseeing where they get referred to, and it's estimated the total program costs us about $7 million, and it's estimated to save $400 million. So the legislature ended up cutting that program. That's one that might have been good to not cut, but if we had put sideboard on Medicaid expansion in 2025, we probably would not have had the cuts to ACT and to other things during the interim between 25 and 26. And we just needed to take responsibility for what was happening earlier on and prioritize our ability to help the vulnerable over the able-bodied. because sometimes we do need to make those tough choices.
So House Bill 93 passed last year. That's a school choice bill that everybody refers to. $50 million was what was allocated. There's some major problems with accountability, which is one of the main reasons I voted against it. I'll give you a couple examples. In that bill, I can form a micro school in my community, in my little neighborhood. I can have a school in my garage. I can invite 6 of my neighbors to bring their family, their kids over. I can charge them whatever I want. I can charge them $5,000. And then each one of them can go to the state and get a $5,000 tax credit to pay for it. So if I have 4 kids, 5 kids, I want 3 of them to go to this micro school, I get $15,000 from the state to pay for the micro school. I can also hire tutors, but it doesn't say in the bill how much you can charge for the tutors or how much they can charge. So I can have my neighbor come and tutor me on my kid on reading or whatever it is at $400 an hour. And that's perfectly fine, as long as I have a receipt. And yes, there's accountability if you can't lie on your taxes, right? We don't want tax fraud. Only 2% of Idaho taxes are audited every year. All right? We are basically redistributing all of our taxes in Bingham County, where we have no private schools, and sending it to Boise and Ada County, where they have most of the private schools. I just fundamentally think that's wrong. So we have lots of school choice. We have homeschooling. We have open enrollment. We have private schools. We have public schools. And we do a really good job on all of those. I'm fine with a school choice program once we've properly funded our public schools as per our constitutional duty. And then let's figure out how to give money to private schools and kids that just really don't.
All right, so let's start with this idea that it's somehow a problem if a family values an educational opportunity enough to pay for it up front and then get reimbursed for those expenses later. You know, I think one of the best kinds of accountability is the free market and the fact that it costs somebody something. And so I've not been a fan of vouchers, but I do really think the tax credit is a great way to go, because it does require a family to put skin in the game. And at the end of the day, they didn't make any money. The money cannot go to the family or to the parents. The money has to go to a school to pay tuition. It can go to reimburse them for a specific expense like a textbook or tutoring, but parents can't tutor their own kids, so it went to someone else. The parent has to be willing to pay for the service, and the free market is what provides that check and balance on the abuse, in addition to the requirement that you report. So beyond that, let's think about this idea that it's a problem for somebody to be able to start a school. So this micro school movement is actually the up and coming thing in the world of education all over the country. People are starting micro schools with specific specialties and expertise to meet the needs of students whose needs are not being met in a public system or who need more specialized attention. I think that kind of choice is an excellent thing. And the fact that it makes it doable on a small scale is what actually is going to solve the next problem, which is this claim that there are no private schools on this side of the state. Because the fact that it would allow someone to start a small school means that we can benefit from this kind of a tax credit even in a rural area. And that, in my mind, makes a lot of sense and seems like a really good thing. So I trust parents. The only way around this kind of accountability that I can see is to just restrict choice. And I think that real free market choice in the education system is the best way to have real accountability by parents who love their kids more than any bureaucrat ever will, who understand their needs more than the state itself ever could. And we want these dollars to meet the real needs of kids and families. That's what the tax credit is designed to do.
I remember 2 years ago I was on the Neil Larson radio show, and he tried to get me to admit that I wasn't conservative enough. And I asked Mr. Larson, are we the Republican Party or are we the Conservative Party? And we went back and forth on that, because I'm part of the Republican Party and it is full of conservatives. But it's not the conservative party, because the Republican Party is also full of moderates. And that's what makes it so amazing and awesome, is that it's the big tent party, like President Reagan said. And it includes everybody who wants to be a part of it, who wants to be part of traditional American values, which is what I stand for. I never looked at a scorecard. I don't care what my freedom score is. In fact, I'm prepared to put it on a t-shirt and say, not a puppet, because I'm here to serve you. I'm not here to serve an agenda of a state or of an agency or an entity that is getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from out-of-state donors who have specific purposes for that. So as a conservative, I believe in family values, I believe in the light hand of government, and I believe that we should let people have agency to live their lives as they see fit.
All right. So I guess my question would be, my opponent did not like the idea that he wasn't conservative enough, because there are lots of moderates in the party, but he's campaigning as a conservative. All of the literature says conservative, the billboards say conservative, and yet there's this interest in defending the right of moderates to be in the party, which sounds to me like he identifies as a moderate and not a conservative. So I think my biggest issue right there is, let's decide. Either we really want to be conservative and let's stick with that idea, or let's say, no, we need moderates, and I'm a proud moderate in the Republican Party, and it needs to have a bigger tent. Let's talk about the big tent for just a second. This was a concept that Ronald Reagan championed, but Reagan's idea was not that we have big tent values, as in conservative values and moderate values and room for all kinds of different values. Reagan's idea was that we have a set of principles that we honor, that we stick to, and when it comes to making decisions about how we champion those specific principles or who champions those principles, we still honor our common principles enough to not attack each other in a way that weakens our ability to be effective in the long term. That's not what I see happening here. What I see happening here is one camp of Republicans that are attacking another camp of Republicans as too conservative and wanting to push them out one side of the tent while they move the stakes over and put down new stakes. It's not big tent Republicanism where we get along with each other in order to defend the conservative values of the Republican Party. This is big tent, as in, give me the covers and you get out of the bed. So I think that doesn't quite hold true in terms of the analogy. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about here is the argument about scorecards. So there are a lot of different scorecards from different perspectives. Some of them are state run, some of them are national organizations that have scorecards. Some of them are special interest groups that have a scorecard looking at how legislators vote on their one issue. So it is important to recognize that every scorecard comes from a certain perspective. And when you look at the score, you should have that perspective in mind. So if Planned Parenthood has a scorecard and you don't share their values, you might not give a lot of weight to that scorecard. But there are scorecards that really focus on conservative values, which is what my opponent claims to be a champion for. And some of these scorecards are state, and maybe there's a chance that a state level scorecard might sometimes have some personality politics involved, and maybe they might be biased on one issue or another because of the personalities involved. I'll give anybody that. But when you look at national scorecards, these scorecards are run by people that don't know the people in Idaho from anywhere. These are political science majors that really are committed to a certain core set of values, and they're reading legislation in states all over the country, and they are doing analysis as to whether that legislation supports principles or doesn't. And then they're looking at the record and they're saying, these bills supported our principles, and this is how the legislator voted, and it's a mathematical equation. So I think those scorecards probably carry a little more weight than something that is local. But here's the thing. When you go to a doctor, he might tell you something, and maybe you believe him and maybe you don't. If you don't, or if you have questions, you're smart to get a second opinion. And if you get a second opinion, and a third opinion, and a fourth opinion, and they all tell you the same thing, and you look at them and you say, your opinions are garbage, I am an independent person and I will do whatever I want, you're welcome to do that. But it might not go so well for you. Because at some point you just can't always be your own expert and be smarter than every other political science major in the country. So I do think that scorecards have their place. The last thing I would say is that most scorecards are not even available until after the legislative session. And so the idea that somehow scorecards control a person's vote doesn't really hold weight in those situations. The only way it could control a vote is if the scores were being announced in advance. But I haven't ever pointed to scorecards that operate that way myself. What I have seen, though, is that the national scorecards tell a very stark story about my record compared to my opponents. And there's only one conservative in the race.
Okay? So then the library bill that passed, House Bill 710, was much less difficult, it was more watered down, but it still had a penalty if any person deemed a book harmful to minors. And it defined harmful to minors as anything that could arouse sexuality. Well, there's some sick people out there who get aroused on some sick stuff. I thought about our libraries. We have National Geographics in there.
Sure.
That also included media like movies. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Titanic. Okay, it's PG-13. There was so many things in that bill that were just, it just wasn't good legislation, and I didn't support it. Not because I want kids to have porn or because I want children's sections to have awful, dirty books, but because when I asked my mother-in-law, they had a list of all these bad books. I said, do you have any of these books in your library? She says, no, and we never would. And I asked the librarian of Blackfoot, Lisa, I believe, and I said, yeah, too many names. And I said,
No, it's Lisa. Harold.
Okay, good, Lisa, yeah. I said, do you have any of these books? And she goes, no, and we never would. And so then I reached out through a connection and said to then Representative Young, have you talked to any of the librarians in our community about these books? No, she had not. So this was another example of a bill that was just trying to create a headline. And so I didn't support it for those reasons. I didn't support it because it's bad legislation. But do you know what I did do, Brian?
What?
We had a bill that came this session on that exact library bill, 710. Because guess what? It's in court right now, right? We're being sued. All of us are being sued because of that bill. Your tax dollars are going towards defending that bill. And so we came and we said, look, we can fix this bill if we add some new features, we strengthen it. One of them was adding a section on adolescence, because you have to look at things in their context. A National Geographic magazine that might have some bare-chested women from Africa in it is different than adult entertainment.
Sure.
Okay? And so the updated bill gave some additional side rails and added some new definitions, and I voted for it.
So a few things there. If you were listening like I was, you might have heard two opposite extremes. First, we said anything could qualify as harmful to minors, and so there would be all kinds of content that's harmful to minors in the library. And then the other thing that we heard is there is no material that's harmful to minors in the library, and I think it's really tough to have it both ways. But the other thing that I hear there is some incorrect information about the definition of harmful to minors. And I will say that I did speak with my opponent during the last election cycle, because this bill apparently was the reason, according to him in at least one of the forums that we were in, that he decided to run. And I think it's interesting that I corrected this same information 2 years ago, and it's still being shared incorrectly. But I'm going to reiterate again now the same thing that we talked about then, which is that the definition of harmful to minors, which comes straight out of our criminal statute and has been on the books for 50 years, has a lot of case law around it, is very specific. This is not an ambiguous definition. It requires a number of things. So if we go to Title 18, which is our criminal statute, and then we go to 1514, and we go down to subsection 6, there is the definition, harmful to minors. And I'm just going to share it with you in its full glory, so you know everything that it must be in order to qualify under this definition. Any description or representation in whatever form of nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, or sadomasochistic abuse when so it has to be those things, but then here's some additional requirements. It appeals to the prurient interest of minors as judged by the average person, not just the random sick person, but as judged by the average person, applying contemporary community standards. And this is something that a court would look at, and a court would ask this decision. The police officer doesn't have to make this decision. The person in the public doesn't make this decision. It's a judge that would decide, is this appealing to the prurient interest of minors as judged by the contemporary community standards? And so in law, when there's an and, it means it has to check all the boxes. It depicts or describes representations or descriptions of nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, or sadomasochistic abuse, which are patently offensive to the prevailing standards in the adult community with respect to what is suitable material for minors. And here's another and includes, but is not limited to, patently offensive representations or descriptions of intimate sex acts, normal or perverted, actual or simulated, or masturbation, excretory functions, or lewd exhibition of the genitals or genital area. Nothing herein contained is intended to include or proscribe any matter which, when considered as a whole and in context in which it is used, possesses serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific value for minors. So that end part means that the courts have ruled that something like the Statue of David that has literary or artistic merit could not qualify under this definition. So it has to appeal to the prurient interest of minors, it has to be patently offensive to the prevailing standards in the community, and it has to show specific body parts and acts. So this is a long, detailed definition. This is not the National Geographic. This is not your average everyday thing, but I can also tell you this. When I served in the legislature, I reviewed many of these materials, as did my colleagues. And those materials were so obscene that when there was an attempt to share them as evidence in a committee and then on the floor of the House, the Speaker of the House prohibited us from passing them out, even when they were in folders. And we had taken measures to ensure that the pages, who are minors, would not be handling them. So there really is some stuff that meets this definition and that's highly offensive. And research was done, and what they found is that there are these materials in libraries across the state. I don't believe that there were these materials in the Shepley Library, and I've said that. But I do know that some of the libraries in this area did have some of the materials that I believe would meet this definition. So here we've gone from one extreme to another, from there is no problem to every book would qualify. And now all of a sudden we're representing that, well, this year's bill was good.
In 2024, when I ran the first time, there was an article that came out that said from 2017 to 2024, the state of Idaho had spent $11 million defending and fighting lawsuits of legislation that we had passed as a legislature. I promised at that point that I was not going to bring legislation or encourage legislation that we knew was going to be challenged in court and cost you, the taxpayer, who knows how much money. For me, that's personal. That's important because those are our tax dollars that need to be spent wisely. So when a bill this year came forward, the headline was, "Keep men out of girls' bathrooms." Well, I don't want men in girls' bathrooms. But when I read the bill and I talked to my Sheriff Gardner, and we discussed it, it became clear that it was unenforceable and that it was most likely going to be challenged in court. So among other reasons that I didn't vote for that bill, I didn't vote for it because I wanted to protect you, the taxpayers, from frivolous lawsuits for irresponsible legislation. That legislation could have been fixed that session. It could have been adjusted, it could have been changed, and it probably would have been okay, and I would have probably voted for it. But that's not what the sponsors wanted to do. They wanted the headline. They wanted the aha and the wow moment. And I'm not going to play those games. So today, what happened? The ACLU announced that they are suing the state of Idaho over the bathroom bill. I just don't know what else to say. I'm not going to vote on legislation that we know is bad legislation. Let's fix it, make it right the first time, because that's responsible governance, and that's what I'll do.
All right, I'm going to work backwards a little bit with this one. So did we hear there at the end the way that we just assumed that we know the motives of the bill sponsors and that the bill sponsors have some untoward motives of just making a headline and no real intention of protecting women? If you do that in the legislature, you get gavelled down. And if you keep doing it, you get sent out of the room. So that is not a great way to address an issue. Beyond that, on this issue, in our system of government, we have a separation of powers. And in the legislature, we have the people's representatives, and their job is to write the law and to define the things that are important to us and that we want to protect. And we do have a responsibility to be good stewards of public dollars. That's important. But the purpose of government is to secure our rights. And part of those rights include privacy, dignity, and safety for women in private spaces. So the way the system is designed to work is that the people's representatives should define how we protect privacy, safety, and dignity in these spaces. Then the executive branch is responsible to enforce it, and the judicial branch gets the opportunity to question it if someone brings a question. That's the way the system works. So if we say, if anybody might have a question, we don't want the judicial branch to do their job, we're not willing to fund that, so we're not going to take action as the people's representatives. Essentially what we've done is we've abdicated our responsibility to be a voice for our constituents to the courts. And we've said whatever the judges want to do, we'll just give it to them up front. And we're not even going to have the discussion. And I think that's a tragedy. So first of all, the priority should be to protect fundamental rights. Then we take care of fiscal responsibilities. We don't have to pick and choose.
Another example of what you're talking about? Okay, so I'm holding two different bills here. All right, so these are what we call statements of purpose.
RSs.
RS. Well, these are the SOPs after the bills are introduced, right? It's part, yeah. So one of them is House Bill 824, and the other is House Bill 827 from 2022. It's the bill for the funding for the Commission for Libraries. Okay. So if you look at the first one, House Bill 824, and you can go down and you can see the federal dollars, the total dollars that's being spent. It's an increase of 30.2% to the budget. That seems like a lot. But when you dig in and look at it, you'll find that there's a line item of $3.5 million of federal funding only. $3.5 million. And you say, well, what's that for? And you come over and it says, telehealth grants. And then you go and you actually read the bill, and you'll find that it's about technology for libraries. And in that technology for libraries included internet content filtering for pornography on computers that would keep kids, give the libraries money to be able to keep kids off the computers looking at things they shouldn't look at.
Okay.
It didn't pass. My opponent voted against it. Then the next day, JFAC brought back House Bill 827, the same bill, the same Commission for Libraries, okay? And you look down, you'll see the total is a negative 10.5%. We're cutting the budget now, negative 10.5%. How great is that? And you say, well, wait, what changed? And you go through, do you know what changed? $3.5 million gone. The telehealth funding and the content filter funding to keep the libraries in compliance with the children, I forget what it's called, the children something law, okay, was gone. And my opponent voted for that one.
Wow. So this is a great example of how having context helps. It's also a great example of the importance of reading the bill and not just the SOP. So I can share with you the backstory of why there was a no vote to begin with, and then a removal of that 3.5 million, and then a yes vote. This was shortly after the first library bill had failed, and the Commission on Libraries was fighting it. They were not coming alongside and helping the legislature to troubleshoot how we could solve this problem of these materials harmful to minors. So we decided that as a legislature in these situations, one of our best levers is the budget. Everybody has to have a budget, and there's a reason that the People's House controls that budget, because it's our job to make sure that the bureaucracies and the agencies address the concerns of the people. And so we informed them that until they were ready to come alongside and support in that issue, we would not be passing the budget. And then we killed the budget. And this was a united effort by Republicans, more than just a majority of Republicans, because we had enough Republicans to kill the budget. After the budget had gone down, people came to the table. The intention, of course, was not to kill the budget and leave it dead, but simply to get people ready to talk about what the solution was. So I happened to be in those meetings, and at the table, along with Representative Gayan de Mordaunt, we worked with the Idaho Commission on Libraries, and they were willing to agree that there was a problem and that they were responsible to help address the problem. And they worked with us on a resolution that identified their responsibility and the problem, and also laid out a solution, which was a working group in the interim. And we laid out exactly who was going to be on that working group, and gave the working group the responsibility to reach a solution during the interim. So once that groundwork was laid and the resolution passed on the floor with the Commission on Libraries supporting it, then I went ahead after that, and when the budget came back from JFAC, I voted yes. Now, the budget did come back from JFAC with $3.5 million federal ARPA dollars removed from the budget. But those dollars, while they were for telehealth and they could have been used for filtering, were not the only thing keeping filtering happening. Filtering is still legally required. And the reason that it would have been good for my opponent to read the bill carefully is that there was actually a Section 4 in both the budget that failed still after the resolution, which I voted yes for, and the next budget, which finally passed. And that Section 4 specifically reiterated that even though that funding was not in the bill, that the libraries were responsible to continue to follow the law and filter the content, and that the companies that they contracted with were responsible to verify that their content was filtered. So we did not remove the funding because we didn't care about filtering. No, we killed the budget because we insisted on the Library Commission coming to the table to help protect kids. Then when they'd done that, then we passed the budget with a requirement that they do exactly that. So this is not what my opponent is misconstruing it to be at all. He doesn't understand the history of what happened there. What this is actually getting the job done of protecting kids. And that's what we ought to be doing.
So it currently says every kid has to go to school unless the legislature says they don't have to go to school. Well, the legislature has many laws on the books that say you don't have to send your kids to public school. You can homeschool them with no regulations. In fact, you don't even have to get a GED if you're homeschooled. You don't even have to report that you're teaching your kid. You just have to tell the school, I'm homeschooling them. Done. I don't know how much more parental rights and how much more freedom you get than that. You can have charter schools. You can have private schools. You can have public schools. You can educate your kids any way you want. You can do it online, any way you want, currently by law. So there is the risk that a legislature would come in and change that law. Okay? But I would think that if that was going to happen, you guys would ask your legislators who are running for election, hey, are you going to change that law? Have any of you ever thought about asking a legislator if they want to change the law that says that kids can't be homeschooled? Okay, so it's not an issue, right? They wanted to change it so that it says education by other means, the right of the people to educate their children without government regulation outside of the public schools of the state shall not be infringed. So I read that and thought, well, first off, the laws allow that to happen. And it says without government regulation. Well, guess what we passed, Heather? House Bill 93. And guess what House Bill 93 has in it? It has some government regulation. So if we ran this bill, House Bill 93 would become unconstitutional in the state of Idaho. So how can I be somebody who doesn't support school choice because I voted against House Bill 93, but then I'm supposed to vote for this, which would undo the school choice bill that I didn't vote for? So it was a big catch-22 to me. I thought that doesn't make sense. And so why do I want to put on the ballot for you guys to decide and have to figure out if this is the right thing or not? Imagine the mailers you're getting right now times 10, right? To do something that we already do.
All right. So this is not a catch-22. This is just complete illogic here. But there are some basic principles that I think are important to keep in mind. If you listen carefully to what's being said, you might hear what I hear, which is that the government already allows parents the freedom to educate their children. The whole point of American government is that we are securing unalienable God-given rights, and we identify those rights in things like a constitution, and then we support and protect those rights in our laws consistent with the Constitution. So God gives children to parents, and the family is a pre-governmental institution. That means that families existed before government. And government does not have a right to go into a family and take away those familial responsibilities and opportunities or to reassign them. So let's start with that. The Constitution is the right place to identify and protect those rights. The idea that if a candidate was running for office and people cared about it, they would ask them in advance is also difficult for me to understand, because there were people wanting to protect those rights. That's why the legislation was being run, to put it on the ballot and give voters a chance to vote on it. The other thing that's good to think about is the fact that having something on the ballot, once there's another ballot measure already on the ballot, does not add a lot of cost, and not all ballot measures result in a huge PR campaign. So we're already looking, most likely, at having an abortion initiative on the ballot. If we add one other thing, it's not going to change the costs significantly. But the bottom line is that parental rights are fundamental rights. But they have not always been protected in the state of Idaho. And it can be easy to forget when you've been comfortable and protected for a while how important something was. In the 1980s, we had courageous parents in the state of Idaho who had done nothing wrong except choose to homeschool their children, who were thrown in jail. And they fought to get those statutory protections for their parental rights. And things like the existing language that's still in our state constitution were part of the problem for them in the 1980s, because they contradict what's happening in our statute. So bringing the Constitution into line with good principles in a way that protects those parental rights, unless you just don't support those parental rights, refusing to align Constitution and statute doesn't make any sense.
I think it's sad that somebody would want power that much that they're willing to spread rumors and gossip in our community. There's nothing more poisonous to a community than rumors and gossip. They set in like gangrene and eat away at the sense of decency. That's a quote from a Haitian author named Wis August. I learned today from a friend that door knockers are saying that I have legislation drafted that would make abortion legal for up to 9 months. Nothing could be further from the truth. I am pro-life. I've always been pro-life. I will always be pro-life. My stance on abortion aligns with the same stance of my faith, and that has never wavered. When people are knocking on doors and spreading rumors and gossip, it has to make you wonder why. When my same friend called my opponent and said, "Did you know this is happening? And you need to put a stop to it because these people represent you. They're spreading your message. Is that what you want your message to be?" She told him, "Well, I can't control what they say. It's too late in the election to do anything about it anyway." I did go to Boise and meet with some doctors. And yes, some of those doctors did donate to my campaign. I'm on the Health and Welfare Committee. I meet with doctors every day. That's my job. For me to meet with doctors in Boise and for some of them to donate to my campaign because they support who I am and my common sense approach to legislating, that's not nefarious. We did not discuss abortion in that meeting at all. We discussed rural health care. We discussed legislation. We didn't talk about abortion. If we want to create rumors and we want to create gossip and we want to drag somebody's character through the mud, I want you to think very closely about who you want representing you. Somebody that's willing to do that, or somebody who just wants to solve problems and make our communities better.
So what I hear in this little post is snap judgment of a situation that my opponent cannot have firsthand knowledge of. I was actually able to find the door knocker that spoke to the person, that spoke to the person, that spoke to Ben. And that sweet little door knocker did not talk about legislation that Ben wrote at all. The door knocker was talking about the abortion ballot initiative and why it's important for people to be informed and vote against that. And then they also talked about their support for me, but they did not talk about my opponent at all. And yet, in the game of telephone tag, by the time it got to the end, rather than going back to find out if that's really what happened, what we have here is a public attack that's condemning other people's character and attacking their motives based on false information. And that's a problem. Beyond that, we have this question of abortion, generally speaking. So as the vice chair of state affairs, I was in the middle of a lot of the discussions around abortion. I worked to address the concerns of the doctors about liability under the abortion statute. And I've heard all of the angles on the arguments around the exceptions that people are interested in. So this is not a black and white issue. And one of the greatest risks to us in Idaho in terms of life is that our strong pro-life statute will be weakened and whittled away until it will no longer be effective at protecting innocent babies. So I think there's a couple of things here. I think for me, it is a huge red flag. We're not talking about a doctor in Boise that gave a donation, but I think it's a huge red flag when you choose to attend a fundraiser sponsored by a group of doctors who are formally organized, and their organization exists because Roe versus Wade was overturned, and they want to restore abortion to OB care. So when you make a decision to attend a fundraiser with a group like that, it's a totally different thing from just I happen to talk to a doctor about something else. And I think that's being sidestepped here. The other thing that I would like to say is that my response to the friend who shared that response with Ben, so again, my opponent, I'll follow proper decorum here, is removed a couple of times and severely misrepresented. What I actually said in that phone call was, first I described what my door knockers were expected to do, which is talk about the initiative. And then I said, at this point in time, the information is multiple times removed, and I would not have a way of knowing exactly what really happened in the first place. But I will definitely be sure to be clear in my communication with the people that I know are helping me, so that we do not have this kind of misunderstanding again. And then I did my homework and I tried to find out where the person was that heard the original conversation and the person that knocked the door. I did find them. But one thing that I thought was a little disappointing is that the person who complained to the person that complained to Ben knew the person that knocked the door in the first place. And I think really the whole situation could have been easily avoided if the person who was concerned had just talked to their neighbor and made sure that she understood what was being said, or at least expressed directly to her what her concerns were. Instead, we have this game of telephone tag and then a public attack, which is unfortunate.
I voted for funding for schools, not 20 times against funding for schools.
20 times against funding for schools. There was a mailer sent out by my opponent 2 years ago that said, Julianne Young consistently votes against education, and it had a long list of bill numbers on it. Interestingly enough, the negative attack mailer sent by Idaho First this election cycle has the exact same list of bill numbers. And I know that most voters would look at that and feel kind of overwhelmed by all of those bill numbers. And so it appears to be this general statement that's got all of this evidence to support it. But there's some interesting things you find if you take time to look up those bills. So here are some of the things that those bills were supporting. A $4 million school database with links to sexually explicit content. That was a no vote. 56 new DEI positions, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, at universities. That was also a no vote. Open-ended bullying legislation sponsored by Representative Mathias, who's a Democrat, that did not establish a legal definition of bullying, harassment, or intimidation, but instead stipulated that the Department of Education was going to come up with those definitions for the legislature. That was also a no. University budgets that had increases of 26% during the same time period when tuition was climbing by 21% and enrollment was declining. Those were no votes. New mandates that added bureaucratic layers without improving outcomes for a single student or teacher. State-funded pre-kindergarten was on that list, and so were those library budgets that we talked about a little while ago that got killed during the time that we were trying to get the Commission on Libraries to the table. What's not on the list is core K-12 funding or teacher salaries or any of the things that you would think of as core supporting education type expenditures, with one exception, and that was an increase in teacher pay for first year teachers only. And I remember really agonizing over that particular bill and then just feeling that it was unfair to offer a raise only to first year teachers while neglecting to give a salary increase to the teachers that had stayed. So that one that was a harder vote, but that's the only one that was a teacher pay or core K-12 funding vote. So it's easy to pull a long list of bill numbers up and make something appear to be one way. But beyond that, when you look at the votes against these bills, on average, 29 Republicans voted against those bills. So this is to vote no on these bills was not a fringe position. This was a very mainstream, these were mainstream Republican votes, and 5 of these bills actually died on the floor. So knowing that history, when I hear someone criticize those votes, what I hear my opponent saying is, I disagreed with these votes, and had I been there, I would have voted for the DEI funding, for the $5 million or the $4 million school database with the pornography. I would have voted for the bullying bill sponsored by the Democrats. I would have voted for all of these things that most Republicans voted against. So hopefully that provides you a little context on this big long list that looks really convincing, because when you get right to the bottom of it, it's just not what it appears.